Dear son, whatever your own sentiments may be with regard to the abilities and qualifications of your preceptors, you should always endeavor to treat them with the respect due to their station, and enjoin the same conduct upon your brothers.
That was Abigail Adams, writing to her son John Quincy Adams at Harvard College in 1786. Abigail spent a lifetime advising her son that the due government of the passions has been considered in all ages as a most valuable acquisition. He always remembered her advice, which inspired him to become one of the greatest opponents of slavery of his time.
If anyone can claim to be a son of the revolution in the sense of growing up during the revolutionary controversy and war, he really has an international experience of representing America.
Having once obtained this self-government, as Abigail put it, you will find a foundation laid for happiness to yourself and usefulness to mankind. And yet, Adams spent a lifetime reproaching himself that he wasn't living up to his unbounded potential.
But after he served his presidency, he would come back and serve the country again.
And he starts a fascinating document in which he basically rewrites the beginnings of the history of the United States, the politics, with slavery as a factor. I mean, he does this thing that recently political historians like me have been trying to do.
Hello, friends. I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center, and this is Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness. You just heard documentary filmmaker Ken Burns and historian David Waldstreicher. They're my guests for this 10th of 12 episodes, where we'll explore what the pursuit of happiness really meant to our founders and what we can learn from their daily struggles to achieve self-improvement. In this episode, we explore the idea of cleanliness in politics and thought through the life of America's 6th president and the first son of a former president, John Quincy Adams.
It is among the evils of slavery that it taints the very sources of moral principle. It establishes false estimates of virtue and vice. For what can be more false and heartless than this doctrine which makes the first and holiest rights of humanity to depend upon the color of the skin? It perverts human reason and reduces men endowed with logical powers to maintain that slavery is sanctioned by the Christian religion, that slaves are happy and contented in their condition, that between master and slave there are ties of mutual attachment and affection. An excerpt from John Quincy Adams' diary.
David Waldstreicher, it is an honor to talk with you about the great John Quincy Adams. You have edited a volume, John Quincy Adams and the Politics of Slavery, Selections from the Diary, where you explore the remarkable complexity, evolution, and inspiring commitment of Quincy Adams and slavery. It was an evolution toward abolitionism, and it went through many twists and turns. How would you broadly characterize John Quincy Adams's move toward abolitionism?
Well, it's really a long, long story. And we have to start at the beginning rather than just focus on the end, the remarkable post-presidential career that Adams had, where he becomes a tribune for anti-slavery, in order to understand just how important and revealing it was that he ends up where he ends up. JQA was the son of John Adams and Abigail Adams. He's really, if anyone can claim to be a son of the revolution, in the sense of growing up during the revolutionary controversy and war, being literally on the stage of national politics, traveling with his father as a diplomat, then going back to Harvard, getting his degree, and then as a young man becoming one of the U.S.'s few diplomats. So he really has an international experience of representing America that was unusual at a time when even people who are groomed to be politicians kind of come up through the states. And he did serve as a senator early on in like 1803, 4, or 5 in Massachusetts, but he really is a national politician from early on. And that reinforces this distinctively Adams kind of disdain for partisan politics and overall concern with the nation. And one of the results is that, like his father, he was from early on clearly not an enthusiast for or believer in African slavery. They both mute their criticisms of it to private letters and try not to talk about it for a very long time, because they know very well that there is a federal consensus by the 1790s to not rock the boat of national politics by making the future of slavery a political issue. That said, it keeps coming back into politics through the back door, through anti-slavery activism, through the issue of the territories, through international diplomacy, in all kinds of ways. But the political function of both Adamses on the national stage through the 18 teens is to try to preserve the center and to find a middle ground between an intransigent and expanding Deep South and an increasingly anti-slavery, or at least post-emancipation, northern states. And this is true even when John Quincy Adams has become Secretary of State in the Monroe administration, where he really understands what's at stake in the controversy over the admission of Missouri as a slave state, but keeps it to himself and to his diary and to the cabinet and to conversations with his admired frenemy, John C. Calhoun. And then he's running for president. He's thinking about having Andrew Jackson actually as his potential vice presidential running mate. He knows that people can guess he's from Massachusetts, he's probably anti-slavery. So he's like behind the scenes saying, no, I'm not going to be looking to ban slavery in the territories or do any of those things when I'm president. Even though the issue does hurt him because some people just try to use it against him, he really is far from an anti-slavery political force through his presidency. But the divisiveness of the issue makes a lot of trouble for him as president. And then he loses to Jackson in 1828. And in retirement, he starts to realize that really, even though he has tried to mitigate it over his career, even though he may believe that enlightened statesmen will eventually put slavery on the road to extinction, as, say, Lincoln later would say the founders always intended, that isn't what's happening. That by 1829-30, it's actually quite the opposite, that the Southerners are in control of national politics. They've leveraged their dominance in one of the political parties, if not both of them, and especially on the newly rising Jacksonian party, to control the federal government and not limit slavery, but rather spread it. And so he starts writing things that come out and say this and start making a distinction between the fatal compromises in the U.S. Constitution over slavery and, by contrast, the Declaration of Independence, which would seem to point in an anti-slavery direction. When he becomes a congressman, he becomes increasingly public about this in orations and in political debates.
You mentioned that it was around 1830 that it became clear that the South was determined to preserve slavery as a positive good. Quincy Adams is defeated in 1828 by Jackson. In 1829, his oldest son, George Washington Adams, commits suicide, which prompts him to a year of reflection, reading the Bible and reading Cicero's Tusculan Disputations. He exhorts America in his address on the Jubilee of the Constitution in 1839 to make the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution principles of political faith, and that becomes central to his vision.
That moment of his retirement, as we might expect, he develops a very ambitious program for what he's going to do in his retirement. In addition to the personal tragedies and the reflection, he starts work on a biography of his father. And he also starts what he calls a political history of the United States, which is unfinished and exists not actually in his original manuscript, but in one that was copied either by Henry Adams or a secretary that Henry Adams employed. It's a fascinating document in which he basically rewrites the beginnings of the history of the United States, the politics, with slavery as a factor. He does this thing that recently political historians like me have been trying to do, and he's already doing it because he realizes there's this thing that has messed up our politics and is to blame for this situation. So he tries to, in as neutral a way as he can, describe the origins of the political parties with the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, and then evolving as they did, and the good intentions of the Upper South nationalists, Madison and Monroe, who he served, in this process of rethinking the political history that he has been an actor in. One of the conclusions that he comes to, which actually goes against the grain of a lot of scholarship to this day, his idea is that the nation was formed in 1776, not 1787. The Declaration of Independence had the intentionality, if not the legal force, of creating a nation, a national people, even if it wasn't a charter of government. And we might think this kind of seems absurd to us because in our civic imagination, the Constitution is the thing that binds us as citizens, as of a national government, as well as of the states, a nation that is made up of a federal system, so that it's both a nation and both preserves the states. What Adams says is that national citizenship was created with the revolution, with leaving England in 1776, with creating a nation that demanded to be recognized by other nations, as the Declaration of Independence did, and that it is to the Declaration that we should look to for our highest ideals. What he's saying is these states' rights Jacksonians who are so into it being a federal government, like really, they just don't like tariffs and they don't like slavery, and their constitutionalism is a warping of the nationalism of 1776.
It's so exciting that you're teaching us about Adams' unpublished political history of the United States, reminding us that he put some of that history in the Jubilee address, where he says the only thing that will save us from civil war is embracing the principles of the Declaration as reflected in the Constitution. He quotes the book of Deuteronomy, take these principles as frontlets between your eyes and place them upon your hands and arms, make them the principles of your political salvation. Describe to us how he tries to enact those principles during the final decade of his life. He is elected in 1831 to 9 consecutive terms in Congress. In 1841, he defends the slaves of the Amistad before the Supreme Court. He denounces the gag rule forbidding the reading of abolitionist petitions. He introduces a constitutional amendment to end slavery. What does he think America has to do to live up to the principles of the Declaration, and what is his hope for America?
He goes from saying slavery is a separate issue and we need to keep it from polluting the other agendas and conversations and negotiations and compromises and nation building efforts that we're engaged in, to almost the reverse, where he sees the way that the problem of slavery has become a political problem that affects the workings of every other political conversation, every other policy issue, whether it's foreign policy, economic policy, personal liberties, the rights of the states. Everything else is now connected to slavery. So he's not an abolitionist, but he comes to see politics the way that anti-slavery people do, which is that slavery is this kind of thing that's polluting and ruining the American experiment and affecting all the other questions. So we need to get rid of it first in order to purify ourselves. Gradually, more and more people believe that. But like most people, even in 1859 in the North, don't believe that anti-slavery is the number one thing on the agenda. But what they are doing is seeing more and more connections between the influence of slavery in politics and the way that it is affecting them personally. And the role that Adams plays is helping to get more and more Northerners to realize that even if they are not personally invested in the profits that are derived from slavery, or they are not especially sympathetic to the plight of people of African descent, the fact that in some parts of the country there are things you cannot say, you'll be mobbed, or you can't say certain things on the floor of Congress because there's the gag rule, or that you can't help a fugitive slave, or you might risk getting arrested by a marshal, that is an infringement on white people's liberties. So that suddenly this issue that seemed to be about whether you thought slavery was wrong or whether you thought black people were mistreated becomes an issue of civil liberties for white people. Adams pushes that by encouraging people to petition Congress against slavery, in 99 different ways. He keeps presenting these petitions, getting attacked for it and censored for it. But then there's a resolution to censure him, or there's a resolution to table the petition. And then he says, oh, can I speak on that matter? And then he gives a speech about how terrible it is that this tyranny of the slaveholders who are censoring him. So he's leveraging the rules of Congress to point out the process by which increasingly pro-slavery political forces are running national politics and putting people in Massachusetts who have elected him in the position of being second-class citizens. He is a major force for the argument that the problem of slavery is a problem for everybody, regardless of what we would consider to be the center of the matter, which would be the problem of race or the immorality of slavery anywhere for anybody.
He dies on the floor of Congress whispering, "I am composed." It's an invocation of Cicero, his favorite author, the meeting death with complete composure. And for me, Adams is the most virtuous of the founders or second founders in a complete symmetry between his devotion to personal and political self-government. Is that a fair estimation?
Well, he always demonstrates and makes a theme in his writings of the necessity for citizens to be paying attention to what's going on and doing their own thinking about it, and the classical notion of public service as serving the highest good. And I think the thing that he likes about the Declaration is precisely this. We think of it in terms of the all men are created equal, and he does come around to emphasizing that, but he also thinks of citizenship as an active process for Americans on a national scale. It's not that he's against thinking globally and acting locally or being a citizen on the local level. It's that he doesn't find it unimaginable or too abstract or too distant that people should be able to imagine themselves as Americans and act accordingly. And that means really being educated and paying attention and participating in this, what he ultimately is willing to embrace as a deliberative democracy. And he starts using democracy in a positive sense eventually in the 1830s and 40s, not accidentally, when he's a member of Congress, the most democratic of the House of Representatives, the most democratic branch. And this is, I think, best brought out in Nancy Eisenberg and Andy Burstein's wonderful book about the Adamses and the problems of democracy, where you really see how the Adamses as the best critics of American democracy, but then eventually in JQA, the most seriously appreciative of its possibilities and necessity.
When we return, I'll talk with Ken Burns about how John Quincy Adams inspired us to clean up our thoughts and actions.
I therefore proceed immediately to say that, in consideration of this case, I derive in the distress I feel both for myself and my clients consolation from two sources. First, that the rights of my clients to their lives and liberties have already been defended by my learned friend and colleague in so able and complete a manner as leaves me scarcely anything to say, and I feel that such full justice has been done to their interests, that any fault or imperfection of mine will merely be attributed to its true cause. And secondly, I derive consolation from the thought that this court is a court of justice, and in saying so very trivial a thing, I should not, on any other occasion perhaps, be warranted in asking the court to consider what justice is.
This is Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness. I'm Jeffrey Rosen. The quotation you've just heard from John Quincy Adams is from his address to the U.S. Supreme Court in the Amistad case, advocating for the freedom of the African captives. Earlier this year, Ken Burns and I had a chance to discuss America's founders and their desire to become more virtuous. A quotation that we both like is from Leo Tolstoy, who wrote, "Sometimes we cannot see any connection between our suffering and our sin, but this connection definitely exists." Ken says that he applies this advice to thought as well as action.
When somebody says clean up your act, they're not asking you to go into the shower. and clean, though cleanliness is a good thing. But what we're talking about is not something I need other people to do, get out of my way if you're driving, but how I can get out of my way and begin to slow those reactive parts down and begin to instill something that has more intention to it.
And my mom told me when I was a kid, you're not responsible for your thoughts, only for your actions, which was very liberating for a teenager, of course. I was glad to get the advice. But I've come to think that ultimately, as an adult, that's not right. You are responsible for your thoughts. They resonate out. They have karmic effects. And we have a responsibility to moderate. We're not responsible for our initial thoughts or impulses, but we have to moderate or modulate them so we can be mindful and intentional. And that's why all of the virtue wisdom comes down to the marshmallow test of those kids.
Yes.
They were given a choice, 1 marshmallow if they wanted immediately, 2 if they can wait for 15 minutes. The kids who could wait did better later in life, and that's what virtue is.
These thoughts come up. It's what you do with them. And that's what it is. My daughter is applying to go away to school, and we don't know what she's going to get into, right? And now we have a whiteboard that changes every day. We're down to 25 days today, and it's been started in the 40s. And every morning she erases this little portable whiteboard. But last night she came into my bedroom after everybody had gone to sleep, and she said, I can't sleep. And she said, what if I don't like it? The place she wants to go to. And I said, probably you won't. There'll be some aspects of it that you won't. But just like right now, there are aspects of the school that you both like and don't like. You will find a way to do it. And she just, went back to sleep.
We have the ability, as my dad always said, quoting Paracelsus, the 16th century mystic, as we imagine ourselves to be, so shall we be, and we are what we imagine.
Right. That's right.
And let's talk about John Quincy Adams. For me, he's maybe the most self-consciously virtuous of all.
I agree.
And he, after constantly beating himself up for not being perfect enough, for if only I had more self-discipline, I could have ended war and slavery, he says, setting an incredibly high bar for himself. And for me, he shows both the potential and the costs of the effort to be perfect.
Nobody came back the way John Quincy Adams, that after he served his presidency, he would come back and serve the country again. And his idea of service and his idea of understanding the way in which this overweening self-criticism and the overweening expectations that he felt had come from father, from the revolution, from all of that stuff, that he could then, in a kind of spiritual judo, use the weight of that stuff to transform it into something that was positive. And I think that's a really important stuff. You will not be without the inevitable vicissitudes, but how you relate to them, what you do with them, how you try to transform them is the better thing.
Spiritual judo, what a great phrase. That says it all.
These are very powerful things. And to use the weight of them to your advantage is the easier thing than to actually fight, because sometimes they outweigh you.
How can we improve our habits and thoughts in ways that can lead us closer to living a life of integrity today? Here's more of what Abigail wrote to John Quincy Adams while he was at college, from her favorite poet, Alexander Pope.
I cannot advise you better upon this subject than in the words of Pope, and as you love poetry, fix the following lines in your memory. 'Tis not enough taste, judgment, learning join. In all you speak, let truth and candor shine. That may alone what to your senses due. All may allow, but seek your friendship too. Be silent always when you doubt your sense, and speak, though sure with seeming diffidence. Some positive persisting fops we know, who if once wrong will needs be always so. But you with pleasure own your errors past, and make each day a critic on the last.
The vision of John Quincy Adams waking up in the White House before sunrise, reading Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, and writing sonnets inspired me to write this song. The second verse is from one of Adams's own sonnets about abolitionism. Who but shall learn that freedom is the prize? It was a great honor for me to set Adams' inspiring words to music and for James to sing them. Here's the baritone's James Martin singing John Quincy Adams with Jennifer Blythe at the piano.
This is the end of earth, I am content, said John Quincy Adams. His head was bent, his eyes were tightly shut, but they could see the divine light that night that inspired and hardwired him to fight for liberty. This is the end of earth, I am composed, said John Quincy Adams, because he knows he's worked his whole life for self-mastery, so that no man can another man's master be. All men must be free in peace and liberty. John Quincy Adams was walking by a river. The sky was dark, but his mind was light, glowing with the fervor. And when the sun came up, he wrote a poem, imagining the sequel when freedom glowed equally in every mind and home. Who but shall learn that freedom is the prize? Man still is bound to rescue or maintain. That nature's God commands the slave to rise, and on the oppressor's head to break his chain. Roll years of promise, rapidly roll round, till not a slave shall on this earth be found.
Thanks for listening, friends. I'm thrilled that my new book is out in October 2025. It's called The Pursuit of Liberty: How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America. Please order online or check it out at a bookstore near you. Pursuit, The Founder's Guide to Happiness, is produced by PRX Productions for the National Constitution Center. From PRX, the team is Genevieve Sponsler, Courtney Florentine, David Newtown, Sandra Lopez Monsalve, Tommy Bazarian, and Pedro Rafael Rosado. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. From the NCC, our team is Annie Stone, Griffin Ritchie, and Bill Pollack. Music and lyrics by Jeffrey Rosen, with arrangements by Greg Stroman. Abigail Adams was portrayed by Robin Lynn. John Quincy Adams was portrayed by Gregory Parks. The songs and incidental music feature baritone James Martin with Jennifer Blythe at the piano and Greg Stroman on trombone for the theme song. I'm Jeffrey Rosen. In our next episode, historian David Blight and I talk about Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln and their influence on each other. This podcast was made possible with the support of the John Templeton Foundation.